Hey, strangers. None of us were prepared for the COVID 19 pandemic. You weren't, I wasn't. How could we imagine, how could anyone in America imagine this past year that's seen hundreds of thousands of people die and hundreds of millions of lives get disrupted? What we've gone through is a mass trauma, a trauma that's affected all of us. And the way you deal with trauma is that you talk about it. We also need to recognize that this past year is a historical event that plenty of books have been already and will be written about. And thus, it's important for us to document what it was like to go through it firsthand for the generations to come. So, I'm going to talk about my experience in the plague year in hopes that it will do some good. My first instinct was to break down in minute detail, point for point, how things went down in my life in my hometown. But after some reflection, I think it would be better to break the year into several emotional themes, starting with no one knows when history is going to start. Logic dictates that the world will follow the inertia of boredom and the status quo. Besides, plagues are something that humanity has far gotten past. They're the subject of history books and great grandparent stories. How could our society, this thriving vortex of men and machines, be ground to a halt by an invisible enemy? Something we can't even see. It didn't matter if it happened in China or in Italy. In some ways, it didn't matter when it happened in Seattle or New York. Don't blame yourself if you thought it couldn't happen here. I didn't. I was very distrusting of the news in the initial period in February because to me, the plague was the perfect news story, perfect for the modern 24-hour media cycle because you can write a new headline every 6 hours. How many people are infected? Where is the virus? How many have died? And it wasn't until CDC officials came out that I started to get worried. And then it wasn't really real for me until the Masters was canceled. I'll step to the side for the first and probably only time in this video to explain the Masters is this super important golf tournament that takes place in my hometown of Augusta, Georgia. It's hard to explain just how big of a deal it is to the city. It alters the entire population for a week with thousands of people coming in from all over the country and overseas. Businesses make a year's profit in that 1 week. People rent out their homes and go on vacation. Schools have spring break on that week so everyone can leave. It's just a whole thing. And the fact that that could be stopped. Whew. That Friday, I attended a small gathering of friends from church. It was the last time in a long while. We all wanted to talk about something other than COVID, but that we weren't able to manage that for more than a few minutes. Some people were panicking. Other people thought it wasn't going to be a big deal. I had been shopping that day for the business that I work for and seeing these massive lines and people stockpiling on pretty much anything they could get their hands on. I think that it comes from, obviously there's the thought of, oh, I'm going to need this, but I also think that the stockpiling and the rush on necessities was an attempt to assert control over the situation. I can't stop the plague from coming, but I can clear out this whole shelf of rice. And then, of course, one person does it because it's the another person does it, do it, and, monkey brain initializes. That Friday in March, I called my grandparents and I let them know that I wouldn't be able to see them until May. I knew then I was lying. I didn't know by how much. And a cruel coincidence, when COVID really became a big deal in the United States, coincided in the pine pollen coming out in Georgia. So everybody is sick, including me, with sniffles and cough and eyes watering. And this just makes you paranoid as hell. I was super paranoid. My folks were actually gone that weekend, and so I have the entire house to myself, and I'm just walking around like a meth-addled rat in a cage. It really felt like a pin dropped and life changed. The clerk at the drugstore wipes down the counter after you check out. Shelves are getting cleared out at the grocery store. The governor and the mayor are arguing on the news about shutdowns. Controversy and high, and everyone is afraid. Alone. I never went through lockdown or what you might call quarantine. I work as a manager at a laundromat, declared essential to the public health. I left my house several times a week, often driving on empty streets. I cannot speak of the claustrophobia and prison like atmosphere other people experience, but I already lived a very isolated life. I had very few IRL friends and mostly just went to groceries, church, and work if I left my house. With the exception of my church closing, my life changed very little, but I felt the isolation all the same. At first, I really didn't mind that much being cut off from my friends, my family, my religion, but as the months rolled on, I think I learned that it wasn't just that COVID took away the joy from our lives, what we like to do, but those things, that religion, those friends, that family, they were a source of stress relief. They made life worth living, and without that stress relief, things piled on far worse. Looking back on last spring and summer, what utterly boggles my mind compared to now is how long it took us to really realize that masks were necessary. Like, I was a bandana person for all of April and May before I was able to get my hands on some good masks. Now I have like a whole arsenal. My glove compartment in my car is just full of like 6 or 7 cloth and surgical masks. There was a lot of misinformation in the early days, counter information, and just pure confusion. Early on in my work, we were heavily concerned with surface to surface transmission. At one point, I was bleaching every surface in the laundromat every hour on the hour, every place a person could put their hand. And now, of course, we know that it's a much bigger deal about aerosolized transmission. What you breathe in. But back then we didn't. Even the best experts were kind of guessing at certain things. And this made it, of course, way easier for the theories to creep in. This thing, it's been here since December, or it was made in a lab. This is a bioweapon. Politics made it worse. I will not dwell long on the politics of COVID-19, but to be clear, the bulk of the blame for the 500,000+ Americans dying lies on the administration of Donald Trump, who downplayed and lied about the severity of the virus. But far worse than that, what doomed us all was the basic realities of what the virus was and how it worked became distorted down political lines. For many, not all, but many, whether or not you thought the virus was a real threat, and what you thought we needed to do with it directly correlated with what news you watched and who you wanted in the White House. Conservative media spread open disinformation and made anti-masking fashionable. And to be as much critical on my own side, I think there were some people on the left who overestimated the threat of COVID-19, probably due to the fact that they were all in New York City, which was just burning around them. Georgia did not burn. I credit a lot of this to early aggressive lockdowns, despite the best efforts of Governor Brian Kemp, who's lying to the people about whether or not people who are asymptomatic can spread the thing. Folks only really started to mask up in the general population, like more than 40% of people, when companies like Walmart told them to. Because, if the governments aren't going to be governments, then the corporations will be governments. And that has never led to anything bad ever. I live in Columbia County, Georgia. I work in Richmond County. Different counties, different political parties, different rules. My church is also in Richmond County, and it shut down relatively early to avoid killing its very large elderly population. That was heavily controversial. When we came back in July with masks, a lot of people did not return. Richmond County had a mask mandate for a time. For a time, my employer was heavily committed to enforcing COVID precautions, which of course made me heavily committed to enforcing COVID precautions. We can have a nuanced conversation about the ethics and constitutionality of mask mandates. I have a lot of thoughts about that. I really don't like people being told what to do. But nothing made me more pro-mask, more pro-restrictions than dealing with the assholes who were against them. I had to spend day in, day out dealing with grown men, mostly white men, in their 30s to 40s, telling them to wear a damn mask. And the whining that I got from these entitled pussies. Oh, it's too hot. Oh, I can't breathe. Oh, this is socialism. These people believe the world belongs to them, and they're all just bitches. Just weak, pussy, ass bitches. You think I don't feel stuffy in the mask? You think my sunglasses didn't fog? You think I'm not hot? I got threatened. I got harassed. And listen, I'm not going to go too deep into this subject, but as a rule, I don't like people. In fact, I would say that I really hate people. I am not inclined to trust them or give them a lot of grace. And to counteract this, I really try and force myself to use empathy, to remind myself that people are complex and they're tired and they have hard lives. Maybe that's why they're doing what they're doing. By September, I ran out of grace. And those really dark thoughts just start slipping in that I really wonder if other people had. I started thinking to myself, the problem with coronavirus is that it doesn't kill enough people. All these modest restrictions are keeping the virus down. It's not rampant in Georgia. Me and other people, we're taking this seriously. We're keeping these dumb fucks safe, and they spit on us for it. Maybe if things were worse, they'd do what they were fucking told. Or they'd just get sick and they'd die, and maybe then we wouldn't have to deal with them. I'm not proud of myself for thinking those thoughts. But I did. When it was up to me on whether or not to require masks, I let it slip. We put a sign on the door encouraging it, but I'm not paid enough to get yelled at all day. The strain was all around. I tried to avoid as much politics as I could in this video, but you can't help but talk about politics. It was an intensely political time, the fall. On top of the country being polarized around coronavirus, the election was cranking up. I live in Georgia, where political competition is extremely fierce. The TV, the radio, the internet, all flooded with ads, rallies for both sides in every street corner. Let me remind y'all that we had runoff elections. So for me, elections didn't end until early January. You had people arguing in public. You had people arguing in church. There's a lot more divisions in the church than you might think. I keep bringing up my church and my faith for several reasons. For one, it shapes much of my life. It's my source of most of my in-person socialization. I volunteered more as the plague wore on, donning a mask to go and run tech worship service for my church. When I'm done recording this, I'm going to go to a band practice. Earlier, I spoke of my hatred for people, and my faith is what teaches me to resist that tendency. But I also think it's a good lens through which to view people. I grew up on the internet post-new atheism becoming the default position of the net. I know what it's like to walk around every day being told you're silly for knowing what you know to be true, and there were times when the virus felt like that. Georgia never really shut down. Almost every business was open the whole time. There were restrictions on eating inside, and maybe half people at a grocery store wear a mask, but things weren't that different. And to be clear, but if you were like in Savannah and Atlanta and parts of Augusta, in Athens, things might be different. Obviously, this changes in demographics. We're a very diverse state, but it was almost like a kayfabe to it. For the months up to September, I only probably knew like 3 to 6 people who got sick, if at all. You just didn't really hear about it. It didn't feel like that big of a deal. At the beginning, at the offset, I was convinced that I was going to fall ill just because of how many people I come in contact with at my work. There were a few close calls. I had to get a few tests, but social distancing and masks, they protected me. It's easy to see how people doubted whether or not it was real or if it was a threat. Yeah, I had people in my shop every day of every demographic doubting whether or not coronavirus was a real thing. It was a conspiracy. They've cracked the codes. It's all a scheme to win the election. This will all be gone by December. So many people said it'd all be gone by December. And of course, there's tons of reasonable people, maybe more reasonable people, but you don't remember them. And your faith just gets whittled down every day, just chipped off. Do you believe the threat not be there? I think that parts of the academically inclined left sort of lost the ball at a certain point on COVID restrictions. Like, I'm supposed to destroy my entire social life and live in paranoia to protect some old people I don't even know or who might hate me. My grandparents are locked away. They are isolated. They're gonna be fine. I'm supposed to protect other people? It's not very convincing. Still, I wore a mask everywhere, and I didn't see anyone in my home who didn't do the same. But the whole point of managing risks is that you make necessary risks less risky. You still take risks. I saw my friends in person, no mask. We wore a mask around other people so we didn't have to do so around each other. But then I went on a date with a person who didn't wear a mask anywhere. It was a bad one too. Didn't go anywhere. It was awkward. But I was so starved of affection that I felt it was worth it. At a certain point, it also became worth it to see my grandparents again. I am not related to my grandmother by blood, but she did help raise me. Over the course of the past 2 years, both her children died. And this set off a sharp decline in her mental function. She repeats the same stories, asks the same questions over and over. She's less curious. She's less sharp. She's not gone. She's still a person, like she looks forward to things. She's aware of the world around her. She watches the news, but she suffers from depression, and we've always been very, very close. At a certain point, she needed to see me, and I found it necessary. I helped her through the pain. It was in her, it was in me, it was all around us as the election neared and the gyre tightened. During the summer, local cases got so infrequent that the local paper just stopped reporting on it. Around September, I started tracking daily national case counts, hospitalizations, deaths. I remember when it was at 800 a day. 1,200, 2,000, 3,000. It was like watching a fire engulf a tenement building, able to do nothing. By December, our luck ran out, and a lot of people around me started to get sick. My employer, a lot of my coworkers, dozens of my church members, my pastor, several of my mentors. My great aunt almost died in the hospital. I have a little cousin down in Macon who has cystic fibrosis. Her lungs ain't great. That's what that means. Every single member of her family got COVID. Some of them got really sick. They were able to isolate her. Grace of God. And I'm sure there are people who still think it's fake. In the winter, it felt like it was a snake tightening around us, a serpent wrapped around my neck. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. It's a threat I can't fight, a foe I can't kill. Eventually, I deadened to the dread. I wouldn't die even if I fell ill. My loved ones were isolating the best they can. the worry, that pain, that paranoia, it dragged on into a background noise, something you no longer hear. And when relief came, I barely noticed it. The pandemic was worse after Thanksgiving and then after Christmas into early January. And after then, it started to fall off and hopefully will only continue to fall off. My mother, aunt, and best friend, they all work in healthcare. So they got vaccinated in like late December. Now, four of my friends, my father, my grandparents, they've all been vaccinated. And just this morning, I went and got my first shot in the arm of Pfizer. Uh, it was super fast. It was no pain worth complaining about. And I'm on my road to being freaking immune to this fucking thing. The threat will fade slowly. You know, for a while we were all worried about those variants. That seems to be less of a problem now, though it was definitely worth worrying about that. Barring any harsh developments, things only seem to be on the up from here. Even if things get worse, I expect most Americans to totally disregard that and leap at the chance to return back to normal and forget everything. I doubt that our society will change much because this year happened. Some people will wear masks more often. Maybe like when they're sick, I will probably or hopefully do that. I mean, I have the masks. I think that a lot of period pieces will be set in 2020. I actually think if you're making like a low budget, say, horror film or with a lot of paranoia, that the quarantine would be an excellent setting for that. We'll talk about it when the next plague happens. We'll be more prepared. This will just be a thing that happened. There's a lot of talk about how COVID won't be gone for a long while, and I expect people to forget that fact. Just totally ignore it. And what lessons should we take from it? I want to be cynical. I want to say that this brought out the worstness, because it did. And I want to say that it made me hate people more, because it did. But social distancing saved hundreds of thousands of lives. All the sacrifice that I made, that you made, that my father made, that everyone made, seeing less people wearing these freaking masks, saved lives. We developed a vaccine, several vaccines, in like a quarter of the time that it took before to do that. Our society weathered the storm and will now move on. I will probably move on. I certainly have a life to live that's far more important than ruminating on the pandemic. I wanted to end this video on a personal lesson. Many refer to 2020 as the year they lost. A lot of people had to sacrifice really important personal events because of the pandemic and the lockdown. You know, graduations, parties, weddings, college, retirements. They feel like it's stolen from them. There are a lot of things that I wanted to do that I didn't get to do. Many are mourning the lack of social life, the isolation, the loneliness. I think that if the plague hadn't occurred in 2020, that I would have gone on the same amount of dates. I am a maladjusted, anxiety-ridden fool who isn't good with people. I didn't have a childhood where I went over and played with friends or went out a lot. There weren't a lot of people who wanted me to go out with them. In any way, it is my nature to die in this house. I cannot allow that. I've been doing a lot of push-ups lately. I'm on a diet, lost 8 pounds. They're putting up some new bars and hangouts in my hometown. In a few months, when everything's safe, I'm going to force myself to check them out, to talk to people, to get on dating apps, do whatever it takes. When I'm unleashed, when I'm immune on like April 29th, I'll use it. If 2020 wasted my time, then I will not allow myself to waste my time anymore. I'm going to use it. I hope you use it too. In the comments, tell me your story of the plague. It can be sad or depressing or funny or awkward or weird. Vent to me. Joke, mourn, do whatever you need to do. I'll read it. You can tell me what lessons you learned, if anything. Or if you just want to throw this year in a box and just never think about it. Next video will be another fun one, I promise. We're going to start ramping up to something special. And until then, no matter what happened to you, no matter what storm you weathered, I genuinely hope that y'all be good.